Sharia. You've probably heard the word a lot. It's constantly in the headlines and it often sparks some pretty intense debate. But what is it really? Today, we're going to cut through all that noise and get to the heart of what this complex idea is all about. So where do we even begin with a topic this big? Well, I think the best place to start is with what most of us already think we know. When you hear the term Sharia law, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Because for a lot of people, the conversation is framed in a very specific way.
A lot of the time, the conversation is framed around this one word: threat. You hear it talked about as a threat to Western values, a threat to modern legal systems. It's a powerful word that can pretty much shut down a conversation before it even gets started.
And then there's this one, conflict, right? News coverage tends to zoom in on the most extreme examples, on acts of violence committed in the name of religion. This creates a very powerful, but also very narrow story.
And of course, the whole conversation almost always gets stuck on punishment. When you put all three of these together, threat, conflict, and punishment, it's pretty easy to see why it's so hard to get the bigger, more nuanced picture.
All right, so let's push all that aside for a minute. To really understand what's going on, we have to go back to the source, back to what the word itself actually means.
So, the word Sharia literally translates to the path or the way. Now think about that. That's not a rule book, that's a direction. It's more like a moral compass, a set of guiding principles that are meant to help people and communities find a just and ethical path through life.
And this path isn't just pulled from one single place. It's actually a living, breathing tradition. It comes from the Qur'an, of course, but also from the example set by the Prophet Muhammad. And, this is absolutely crucial, it's also shaped by centuries of intense debate, reasoning, and interpretation by scholars trying to apply these core ideas to their own times.
And its scope is just massive. It's not just law in the way we might think of it. We're talking about a whole framework for living. It touches on personal ethics, like how to pray or when to give to charity, but it also gets into the nuts and bolts of society, business contracts, family life, and the principles of justice and fairness.
Okay, so you can already see this huge gap opening up between the common perception and the deeper reality. So let's just go ahead and tackle some of the biggest myths head on.
Now, this is probably the biggest one out there. The myth of a single, unchangeable Sharia law book that's applied the same way everywhere. The reality? That's just not how it works. Sharia is a set of principles, and how those principles get interpreted and applied can look wildly different depending on the culture, the country, and even the century we're talking about.
And this chart, wow, this really puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? The part that gets basically all the media attention, the criminal punishments, is just a tiny sliver of the whole thing. Look at that. The vast majority, the real core of it, is about the stuff of everyday life, personal ethics, charity, family law, business. It's the moral infrastructure of a community.
All right, so that brings us to the big political question, the one you hear all the time. Can a system rooted in religious guidance coexist with a modern democracy?
Well, the answer might surprise you. There isn't some fundamental built-in contradiction. In fact, many Muslim-majority countries, like Indonesia and Malaysia, are functioning democracies. They've found ways to build constitutional frameworks that actually blend civic law with Islamic principles, allowing them to coexist.
So the big takeaway here is that Sharia is not this one single thing. It's not a monolith. Its application around the world is incredibly diverse. So let's actually look at some real-world examples to see what that means on the ground.
This table is fantastic because it shows you just how different things can look. In places like Morocco and Jordan, its main role is in family law, things like marriage and inheritance. Then you look at Malaysia, where it exists right alongside a separate secular civil law system. In Tunisia, the entire constitution is interpreted through the lens of Islamic principles. And for millions of Muslims living in Europe and North America, it's a personal ethical guide, something that shapes their individual lives, completely within the laws of their country.
This long history and this amazing adaptability have led to some really fascinating and frankly surprising connections, including one right in the heart of the American legal system.
Yeah, you heard that correctly. Right inside the U.S. Supreme Court building, there's a marble carving from the 1930s that honors the Prophet Muhammad. He's up there with other great lawgivers from history, like Moses and Confucius. Now, this isn't a religious endorsement. It's a recognition of his contribution to the global heritage of justice and law.
Okay, so with all of this context in mind, let's bring it all together. Why does getting this right actually matter so much?
Well, these misconceptions are so sticky for a few pretty clear reasons. First, the media thrives on conflict. It makes for a better story than a deep dive into legal philosophy. Second, political rhetoric loves to simplify complex ideas into easy slogans and soundbites. And finally, for most of us, our only exposure to this stuff comes from isolated and usually violent news reports, not from any kind of calm scholarly discussion.
And that's a real shame, because if you actually take a step back and look at the big picture, you start to see something amazing. You see that Sharia, Western law, international law, even though they come from totally different places, one from faith, others from secular ideas, they often share the same fundamental goals: justice, fairness, and human dignity.
I love this quote from our source material. It just nails it. Different routes, similar destinations. They're different paths for sure, with different maps and different histories, but so often they're striving to get to the same place. Which really leaves us with one final question to think about. What is the real value in taking the time to understand a system, a culture, or a tradition, especially one you don't personally follow? Perhaps, just perhaps, it's that genuine curiosity and a little bit of context are the best possible antidotes to fear.